So I'll be talking today about projects that we sort of are calling biological and inspired artificial intelligence. And I'll do a full loop. I'll start by talking a bit about AI. Then I'll talk a bit about some of the questions that appear when we want to use the brain as an inspiration tool for AI development. And then I'll talk a bit about what type of RRI type approaches we are planning to work on in order to ensure that we work responsibly. But let me start to tell a bit about this project. So this is a cross or interdisciplinary collaboration between different types of groups. Let me see. So we have, it's essentially the collaboration between the two groups that are more or less the same. It's a large group we have at the University of Oslo called SINPLA, the Center for Integrative Neuroplasticity, that's headed by Marianne Fien. And we have been working for a long time together to try to bridge experimental type neuroscience, computational neuroscience, and physics type modeling. And then it's a newer spin-off of that, which is closely related, which is an activity on what we call biologically inspired artificial intelligence, where the aim is essentially to develop new types of AI algorithms based on the way the mind or the brain works. Where does this come from? Essentially, it comes from the observation that sort of new AI technologies are becoming more and more powerful. I mean, they can be used in health, as we will discuss today. They are unfortunately, a part of our social infrastructure now, I think, with very negative consequences for all humankind, in my opinion. And they also are very good at solving things like strictly defined situations, like you have in games, for instance, computer games. They're also extremely fragile in some of these situations. This is very clear in computer games, where you can train AI algorithms to be excellent at playing Space Invaders, but if you change one or two of the pixels in the images, suddenly the computer algorithm becomes basically useless. And this points to the fact that the brain essentially is superb at solving open-ended problems. Compared to machines, it typically needs very few repeats. It doesn't really need much data, and it's extremely energy efficient. In addition to that, the brain is essentially optimized through evolution. So much of the circuitry that you need to walk, for instance, is present in many type of animal babies the moment they are born. So it's not something that's learned, it's something that's essentially innate. It means that there is actually a lot of structures already that are well functioning and that are optimized for learning and optimized for learning in a physical world. And part of our motivation is in this project has been, how can we learn from this in an efficient way to try to make AI algorithms more effective or more efficient. And this has a long history essentially in neuroscience, where early on AI systems, at least the way they have been designed, are essentially inspired by theories in neuroscience. And this comes to sort of the first type of models for the perceptron, for instance. It comes from this Hebbian type of dynamics, where you model this aspect that neurons that fire together wire together. And this is something that's again now turned up as an important model in AI type models. And of course, in the end, what we want machines that can learn from experience. And if you now look at some of the improvements that's been made in AI, some of the recent ones have in some sense been based on insights from neuroscience. You can see that artificial agents, rats that are trained to navigate, they develop grid cell-like patterns, for instance. And there has also been some discussion about how we can use brain type structures to develop more efficient neuromorphic computers, for instance. So this is the area that we are moving into, and I like to take that one step further. So what I'd like to mention to you now is essentially something that we just submitted. This was a new proposal, but it's a natural extension of this Bio AI project. But I think it's a good case to discuss some of the ethical consequences or perspectives. And the idea of this project is essentially to reverse engineer the brain in order to develop a next generation AI. So what are we going to do then? We're going to develop a new theory for how to figure out causal reconnections or causal structures in the brain. And then we're going to use that theory on experiments with rats. And we use that to going to generate the next generation of bio-inspired foundation models, and come back to what I mean by that, and implement a bit in computing hardware. So a bit more detail of what the plan is to do. If you start on the left there, the idea is that we are in the process of developing new, or it's really Mikkel Lepperød who's in this process of developing new methods to find connectivity or causality in structures. So what does this mean? Well, I could explain it from any of these pictures. The idea is that if you know the sequence in which neurons fire, you might think that this is related to causality, that the one that fires before the second one are causally related. But of course, what you really would like to find is that you'd like, in some sense, to find the weight matrix, to find how are these neurons actually connected. We can do this in synthetic data. So in this case, we generate the data where you sort of have neurons and you have this firing and you have the sequence, and then you know how the weights between these different neurons should be. And then you can try to do the inverse problem, which is a very difficult problem, is to try to basically, given this sequence of firings, try to figure out what are the weights between the neurons. And this is something we've been working on in synthetic models to try to find good ways to do that inverse problem, using, again, machine learning methods, essentially, to do that inverse model or problem. And I think we've made some really good progress on that. Now, if you're able to do that, what you then can do is that you can, based on experiments, and this is the case of experiments that Marianne may be doing or is currently doing in her lab, where you do 2-photon imaging in order to essentially see the somewhat slow time dynamics then of a large population of neurons and their firing. And in principle, at least, based on this image, or maybe based on electrode data where you have a higher time resolution, you might be able to have a similar type of problem. You have the sequence of firings, and you'd like to go back to figure out from those sequences what's the real connectivity. And then the idea is that based on this, you can actually, in some sense, find out what's the innate connectivity of the brain of the mice. And if you do this in well-selected areas, you might actually learn something about these important type of, let's say, pre-trained, pre-existing connectivity structures that are in the brain that may be due to evolution, they may be due to training during the lifetime. And then the second part of this is that can we then take these models and use them as pre-trained foundation models, essentially, models that will be used across many type of learning tasks in AI, or as a foundation for the way that we're doing the wiring in a neuromorphic computer. So this is sort of the background. And then the fun starts, because now there is a lot of possible consequences of this. So let me start by the ones on the left side, which are sort of what problems are definitely going to arise in this case. Well, the first one is that foundation models. So foundation models is what they often use in these language models, for instance. So some of the really large language models are called or are used as foundation models, and then they're used for many different type of research questions or research tasks afterwards. And if these models have inbuilt biases, then those biases will be inherited by all applications using these foundation models. So of course, this is something we would expect, that if we develop a fundamental model, in this case for transfer learning or for this type of fundamental connectivity of the brain, well, if there are biases in that model, it's going to be inherited. The second question, which I find quite interesting, is sort of who has the ownership to the circuits of your brain or your animal's brain? Some of it is biological and some of it is trained, and we don't really know what is what. I think this is probably a quite deep question. If you're able to scan aspects of the brain and use it for something, is different than scanning just a biological system. It's different than just taking the DNA of an animal, because we don't really know what's the sort of the physiological part and what's the trained part of your brain. And then it's also an important question is sort of what are the perceptions and consequences of such a technology, essentially scanning the brain and developing that into a chip if it is successful. That's sort of the easy parts. And then the difficult parts, that's sort of the unforeseen outcomes. If you scan the brain of somebody, how do you know that this rat, for instance, or mice mouse doesn't have some built-in responses that are part of this circuitry that you haven't really seen, but that might appear in the type of model that you're using based on that circuitry. It's also sort of poses toward a race to extract and pattern circuits of the brain, which might be worrying. At least we might need to think about it if it occurs. And in some sense, we might also be bypassing this explainability and issue and the race for the brain for artificial general intelligence by sort of, we don't have to discuss it because we're doing the human brain and or eventually or a mouse brain. So how do we address this type of questions? Well, we have to figure out essentially who are affected, who are sort of the relevant groups to involve in these type of discussions of these questions. And then also what frameworks should be used to address the possible consequences. And what we suggested in this project, which I think is actually a quite original take on it, is that in this case, because it's a quite broad set of possible outcomes, we wanted to include students in this case. So we have a broad interdisciplinary honors program at the University of Oslo, which is a 3-year honors program, where they are essentially introduced to AI problems. We have students there who are involved in ethics, philosophy students. We have students involved in mathematics and physics, and students who come from the social sciences. So they actually span a quite broad part of actually included in various types of courses. So we would include it early on in the course program. We would include it in discussions that we had with students. We would invite some of the project participants into this project and to discuss with the students, and students together with the researchers would write what we call reflection notes on the on the aspects of the technology. Yeah, so this is essentially what I summarize now. We would introduce and involve the students in the problem. We would reflect and anticipate the impacts together with the students. And this would typically be the program teachers and invited speakers. And we will also involve the participants in the bio-AI project as invited lecturers and discussion partners for the students. And then we will have student teams that will work on thesis projects that are relevant for this project. Yeah, that was essentially what I wanted to convey. This is sort of just opening up a new box. It's a slightly different approach on RRI that I'd be happy to discuss with you also. That I at least found quite interesting as soon as I sort of thought of it. And then we will hopefully gradually gain experience on this take on RRI over the next few years. Thanks.